My name is Evelyn, and for the last 5 years my world has been the size of this garden. Each rosebush was planted by my late husband, Arthur. The deep red ones were for our passion, he'd say. The gentle pink for our firstborn son, Mark. The bright yellow for the laughter that filled this house. Arthur has been gone a long time now, but his memory lives in every petal and every thorn. This house, this garden, it's not just brick and soil. It is the library of our life together. I always believed my son Mark understood this. I thought he saw the same memories I did when he looked at the climbing roses scaling the old brick walls. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. The change was subtle at first. It began with phone calls. "Mom, are you sure you're okay all by yourself in that huge place?" Mark would ask, his voice laced with a synthetic concern I was only beginning to recognize. His wife Sarah would echo him on the speakerphone, her voice always a little too bright, a little too sharp. "Evelyn, darling, we worry. What if you fell? No one would know for hours." I would always reassure them. "I am perfectly fine, my dears. The garden keeps me busy, and Mrs. Gable next door and I have tea every afternoon." But they weren't listening. They were planting a seed. The day it all became clear was a Sunday. They came over for lunch, not with the pot roast I loved, but with glossy brochures. They spread them over the dining table where Arthur and I had shared thousands of meals, covering the familiar wood grain with images of sterile, modern apartments. "Look, Mom," Mark said, tapping a picture of a sleek, white building that looked more like a hospital than a home. "It's called Golden Vistas Senior Living. It's brand new. It has a community pool, organized activities, and on-site medical staff. You wouldn't have to lift a finger." Sarah chimed in, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "And the best part is it's all in one building. No more worrying about climbing stairs or maintaining that massive garden. Think of the freedom, Evelyn. Freedom. They called it freedom to be locked away from everything I loved." I looked from their eager faces to the brochures. Golden vistas. There were no vistas here, only pictures of identical rooms with bland, beige walls. There were no gardens, only a patch of manicured lawn where no one was allowed to dig. My voice was quiet when I finally spoke. "But this isn't my home. My home is here." Mark sighed, the sound of a patient man dealing with a difficult child. "Mom, we have to be realistic. This house is a money pit. The property taxes are a fortune, the roof needs work. It's a burden. For you and for us." There it was. The truth wrapped in a thin veil of concern. "If we sell the house," Sarah added, moving in for the final push, "it would give you more than enough to live comfortably at Golden Vistas for the rest of your life. And the leftover money, well, Mark's business could really use an investment. It would be a win-win for the whole family." My heart, which I thought had grown steady and quiet with age, began to beat with a painful, heavy rhythm. They had already spent the money from my memories. They had sold my life before I had even agreed to leave it. "No," I said. The word was small, but it felt as solid as the oak tree Arthur planted when Mark was born. "No, I am not leaving." The pleasant masks they wore cracked. Just a little. Mark's jaw tightened. Sarah's smile became a thin, hard line. "Mom, don't be stubborn," Mark said, his voice losing its patient tone. "We are your only family. We are trying to do what's best for you." "What's best for me," I replied, my own voice gaining strength, "is to live in my own home, surrounded by the memory of my husband until my last day. This discussion is over." I stood up and began to clear the plates. The lunch was over. But the war had just begun. In the weeks that followed, their campaign escalated. The phone calls became daily demands. They stopped visiting, replacing their physical presence with a chilling emotional distance. Then the strangers started appearing. One afternoon, a man in a sharp suit knocked on my door. He was a real estate agent. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Mark sent me. He said you were interested in getting an appraisal for the property. Can I come in and have a look around?" I felt a cold fury rise within me. I stood in the doorway, blocking his path. My son was mistaken. This house is not for sale. Not now, not ever. "Good day, sir." I closed the door on his surprised face. I called Mark immediately. He didn't even bother to feign innocence. "Mom, you're being irrational. I was just trying to get the paperwork started to make it easier for you. That house is worth a fortune in this market." We're talking over $1 million. It is not a fortune. I shot back, my hand trembling. It is my life. And you do not have my permission to put a price on it. The cruelest blow came a week later. I was in the front yard pruning Arthur's favorite rosebush, the Mr. Lincoln, with its deep velvety red blooms. Sarah's car pulled up. She didn't get out. A different man did, a contractor with a clipboard. He walked onto my lawn and started pacing around the garden. Sarah rolled down her window. Evelyn, this is Bill. We're just getting a quote. A quote for what? I asked, my heart sinking. She waved a dismissive hand towards the garden, towards Arthur's legacy. Oh, for clearing all this out. When we sell, the new owners will want a clean slate. A nice modern lawn, maybe a patio. All these thorny, overgrown bushes are just a mess. A mess. She called my husband's heart work a mess. I saw him in my mind's eye on his hands and knees, carefully working the soil, his face smudged with dirt but lit with a creator's joy. I looked at the contractor, who was now pointing at the old oak tree. That was it. The final straw. The part of me that had been making excuses for my son, the part that had been clinging to the hope that he was just misguided, finally died. In its place, something cold and clear and hard began to grow. That night I did not sleep. I sat in Arthur's old leather armchair, the house dark and silent around me. I thought of my husband. He was a quiet man, a high school chemistry teacher, gentle and unassuming, but he was also brilliant. He saw the world in ways others didn't. And he was methodical. He always had a plan. Just before he passed, he had been weak, but his mind was sharp. He held my hand and made me promise him something. Evelyn, he had whispered, his voice raspy. Promise me you will live your life fully. Don't let anyone make you small. Our son is a good man, but he has a weakness for shiny things, and his wife encourages it. If they ever try to take this house from you, you go to my desk. In the bottom left drawer there is a key. It's for a safe deposit box at the downtown bank. The other key is with Mr. Harrison, our lawyer. Go to him. He knows what to do. Promise me, Evie. I had promised, my tears falling on our joined hands. I had forgotten about it, buried the memory under the weight of my grief. But Sarah's cruel words had unearthed it. The next morning I did not go into the garden. I went to Arthur's desk. The key was there, just as he said, tucked inside an old copy of Moby Dick. It was a simple old-fashioned brass key. I held it tight in my palm. Felt like a weapon. My next call was not to my son. It was to Mr. Harrison. A week later I invited Mark and Sarah over. I told them I was ready to talk. They arrived beaming, carrying a folder full of paperwork. They walked in as if they already owned the place, Sarah already pointing out walls she would knock down. They found me sitting at the dining table. But I was not alone. A distinguished, gray-haired man in a perfectly tailored suit sat beside me. Mark, Sarah, I said, my voice calm and steady. I believe you remember Mr. Harrison, your father's lawyer. The smiles vanished from their faces. Confusion replaced their triumphant looks. Mr. Harrison? Mark said. What's he doing here? Your mother invited me, Mark, the lawyer said, his voice polite but firm. She had some legal matters she wished to discuss. And as the executor of your father's estate, I was happy to assist. He gestured to the folder they were holding. I see you've brought some documents. Sarah, ever the bold one, placed the folder on the table with a thud. Yes. We have the sales agreement for the house and the admission forms for Golden Vistas. We just need Mom's signature. Mr. Harrison picked up the folder, but he didn't open it. I see. Before we get to that, there are a few items from your father's will that I believe we need to revisit. Mark scoffed. The will? That was settled years ago. The house goes to Mom and then it comes to me. It's simple. But it's the details that are important, Mr. Harrison said, opening his own leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick document bound in blue. Arthur was a very detailed man. Let me read you Clause 7b. My beloved wife Evelyn shall have sole and undisputed ownership of our marital home at 125 Oak Lane for the duration of her natural life. She is free to live in it, modify it, or sell it as she sees fit. My son Mark shall inherit the property or the proceeds from its sale only upon her passing, on the specific condition that he has, in the judgment of the estate's executor, acted as a dutiful, loving, and supportive son to his mother. Mr. Harrison looked up at them over the rim of his glasses. A heavy silence filled the room. Actions such as attempting to coerce his mother into selling her home against her will, or attempting to place her in assisted living for personal financial gain, he continued, his voice like ice, would, I'm afraid, constitute a complete violation of this clause. In such an event, the property and all its proceeds would be donated in its entirety to the National Rose Society and the American Chemical Society. Sarah's face went pale. Mark looked like he had been punched. What? That's ridiculous. You can't be serious. Your father was very serious, Mr. Harrison said calmly. He loved your mother very much. And he was an excellent judge of character. Sarah finally found her voice shrill and panicked. This is insane. We were just trying to help her. This old house is falling apart. She's living on a tiny pension. We're the ones who have to support her. I had remained silent until then, letting Arthur's words speak for him. But now it was my turn. You have never given me a single dollar, Sarah, I said, my voice cutting through her tirade. Every month for the last 5 years, I have been the one transferring money into your account, to help with your mortgage, to pay for your fancy cars and vacations. Money you told me was for business emergencies. Mark couldn't look at me. He stared at the table, his face a mask of shame and fury. But Mr. Harrison was not finished. And that brings us, he said, reaching back into his briefcase, to the matter of the safe deposit box. He placed the small brass key on the table next to another, identical one. Arthur left instructions that this box was only to be opened in the event that your character, Mark, was called into question. I believe that time has come. He pulled out a sheaf of papers. You see, you believed your father was just a humble chemistry teacher. In a way he was. But in his spare time in his basement workshop, he wasn't just pottering about. He was inventing. He slid a document across the table. It was a patent. Do you know what this is? He asked. It's the patent for a specific polymer bonding agent. It's a tiny, unglamorous little chemical formula. But it happens to be the single most effective, heat-resistant adhesive used to assemble the processors in nearly every smartphone and computer manufactured in the last 15 years. Arthur sold the patent to a major tech corporation a year before he retired. He didn't want the fuss, so he took a small lump sum in a royalty agreement. A very, very small royalty. Just a fraction of a cent per unit. He paused, letting the information sink in. But when billions of units are sold year after year, those fractions of a cent add up. He slid another paper across the table. It was a bank statement for a trust account. Mark and Sarah leaned forward, their eyes scanning the page. I watched as Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Mark let out a choke sound. Your mother is not living on a small pension, Mr. Harrison said, his voice quiet but final. The trust your father established for her, which I have managed since his passing, currently holds a value of $17,428,000. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the clock Arthur had wound every Sunday morning. Mark finally lifted his head. His face was a wreck of disbelief, greed, and despair. 17 million? He whispered. Mom, why? Why didn't you tell us? I looked at my son, at the man he had become, and I felt not anger, but a profound and desolate pity. Why, Mark? I asked, my voice soft. So you would pretend to love me? So you would visit more often? So you would value me based on the number in my bank account instead of as your mother? Your father wanted me to have a peaceful life, not to be seen as a walking bank vault. He gave you every opportunity to be a good man. You are the one who failed his test. I stood up. I felt taller than I had in years. Mr. Harrison will show you out, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. The monthly payments to your account will stop, effective immediately. I suggest you learn to live within your means. Do not call me. Do not come here again. You are no longer welcome in this house. Sarah started to sob, a mixture of rage and self-pity. Mark just stared, his eyes empty. They were not mourning the loss of a mother. They were mourning the loss of a fortune they never knew existed. Mr. Harrison escorted them to the door. I did not watch them leave. I walked to the window and looked out at my garden. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over everything. When Mr. Harrison returned, he looked at me with kind, sad eyes. "Are you all right, Evelyn?" "I am," I said, and I was surprised to find that it was true. I felt a sense of release, as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. "What will I do with all that money, Henry?" He smiled. "Anything you want, Evelyn. Anything at all." In the months that followed, I found my answer. I established the Arthur Vance Foundation, a grant program for promising young science students from low-income families. I had the roof of the house repaired and the whole place repainted. I hired a young, enthusiastic gardener to help me manage the roses, a girl whose hands were as skilled as Arthur's once were. My life is quiet, but it is not small. My world is still the size of this garden, but now it is open to others. I host an annual rose festival, and the garden is filled with laughter and the faces of strangers who appreciate its beauty. The house is no longer silent. It is filled with the chatter of scholarship students I mentor, their minds bright with the same curiosity that lit up my Arthur's eyes. I never heard from Mark or Sarah again. I sometimes wonder if they are happy, if they found their golden vista. But then I look at the new rosebush I planted by the old oak tree. It's a variety called Peace. Its petals are a soft, creamy white, edged with the faintest blush of pink. And I know that I have found mine, right here, in the home that love built and that truth protected. The last rose of my summer is still in full glorious bloom.